So, background, some of you have heard this 100 times. I spent 8 years in industry. I spent 10 years at Rochester Institute of Technology. One of my functions in that role at RIT was an editor-in-chief of a newly formed journal. It had one editor-in-chief before me. And so we were really figuring out a lot of this stuff and how to do it. And I can tell you, it's a lot of on-the-job training, right? There's no quick spend a weekend at a seminar and learn how to be an editor-in-chief. So how many of you, the professors, you had this question come up this week? A young man or young lady shows up at your office door and they greet you warmly and they say, well, I haven't done about half the homework and I got a 78 and an 81 and an 83 on the first three tests. What are my chances of getting an A? Have you had that question this week? Well, and you know that feeling that you get when you say, dear beloved person, right? Your problem is not an A. Your challenge today is for a B, right? And you have to, well, that's sometimes how the editor-in-chief feels when we submit our manuscripts, because we do things that to them are kind of obvious. And so the way they became obvious to me was I was the recipient of some of those things. So agenda, we have one. We're going to get through it. We're going to talk about scholarship. We're going to talk about the journal, and then the publication process. There's 3 packets in front of you. One is a blown-up picture of the process of a manuscript becoming a journal article. So a manuscript is a draft, and a journal article means it's been published. And that's because the one inside your packet is an eye chart. And then there's a packet of the slides that I'll use, and then there's some reviewing forms. Wouldn't it be nice to know what questions are commonly asked when they review your paper? And when I show you what they are, you'll go, well, that makes sense. But I didn't know until I needed to know. So scholarship, what's scholarship, right? The smart aleck answer is scholarship is what scholars do when they claim to do scholarship, right? That's the academic who feels no need to explain themselves. Generating, applying, or integrating and disseminating information. If all we're doing is running around our lab and generating new stuff or teaching and coming up with new techniques, but we never disseminate it, it's not scholarship. It's really good work, but it's not scholarship until you publish it. So it's not scholarship until we disseminate it, and to do that, you need peer review. Someone else has to say that not necessarily that these ideas are right, but these ideas aren't grossly contrary to known facts. So our technical training prepares us well for generating information, right? We can learn our disciplines, whether they be biology or engineering or statistics, and we learn some experimental methods things along the way. And we have this set of tools, the scientific method, design of experiments, simple hypothesis testing, and we learn as technical people, but as non-technical people, how to evaluate data and make information, make decisions and recommendations. But we really don't get a lot of training in how to write. My best training in how to write came from when I wrote my dissertation. I would email it to my advisor. Initially, he would not read it himself. He would have a senior PhD student whose first language was English, or a administrative assistant read it and write all over it. And once I went through a couple rounds of that, then I would be blessed with the redness of his pen, and he would write all over it. And I actually learned how to write because he kept correcting the same things. Right? Stuck on that again. Of course, he's at his desk saying he keeps doing the same thing, right? And so by sheer critique, I learned how to write better. Of course, I had some training in it. So JSET, what's the background? It's applied technical scholarship, engineering, technology, and physical sciences. What's the physical sciences? Geology, chemistry, physics, not the life sciences. So biology and medicine are typically not included in the physical sciences. The purpose of the study had to be clear. The intended results had to be consequential. So I'm going to give you a quote. You got to picture someone in a rather pedantic manner, perhaps with waving arms, saying, to triumph, we need results. Publishable, applicable results. Now, who among you will be the next Morse, the next Einstein? I think you've probably heard this before. Anybody recognize it? It's Dr. Hellinger, who's the professor of John Nash in A Beautiful Mind. So if you haven't seen A Beautiful Mind, I always, with hesitation, recommend movies because I forget the real nasty parts, but I think you'll be okay in this one. Maybe the children won't be too clear while you watch it. I think it's interesting. So JSET background, right? Where's the paradigm that I come from? JSET is not clear, and it shouldn't be, is the Journal of Applied Science and Engineering Technology. So the trick with one of these journals is you come up with some sort of name, right? The Journal of Engineering Technology, what they call it JET, right? They have a short version of the name, and you try to make it so that at least those in the group know how to pronounce it. So scholarship of application is the focus, and it comes out of Boyer's model. Has Boyer's model been discussed much at LeTourneau? So Ernest Boyer. I'll reference you to the book here at the end. The overview of that is we started off with land grant universities, and the federal government gave money to the states, and the states either built a university there or they sold part of the land, used the money from the sales of part of the land to then build the university. But the cause was the common good, and that's why I suspect, without knowing for sure, that Texas A&M is probably a land grant university. It's that ag and mining focus, that common good for the public. So in addition to research, Boyer has broadened this term to call it scholarship. And he talks about discovery, right? You go in the lab, you mix A and B together, you shake vigorously, and you get C, and then you write that down. You go, wow, we got C, right? Which is physics or chemistry. Engineering is, I want C, what do I have to do to get it, right? We start with the end and we work backwards. So application, applying known facts to new problems is another area of scholarship. Integration, taking facts across disciplines and realizing that it's the same model that occurs, and I'll give you one, and I'll try to make it as non-detailed as possible because it's lunch. The cruise control on your car monitors the wheel speed, adjusts the throttle, right? So it's a feedback loop. It's not all that different from a zebra at the watering hole, smelling for the lion, right? And adjusting to whether or not they detect the presence of the lion. It's still a feedback loop, right? It's taking a principle from one discipline and realizing that it crosses over into another. And then teaching, right? The idea of coming up with assessment techniques and publishing on this. So it's not that teaching in itself is scholarship, but when we published that I did this active learning technique and I engaged the students this way, the control group said whatever, and the non-control group said whatever, and we compare it, right, to publish those results, which is probably some low-hanging fruit at LeTourneau, giving our teaching-focused mission, right? We have to do that. If we can tuck some scholarship in with that, we'll get synergy in our efforts. So that's it. That's the whole process for publishing a paper. It's real simple, right? You have this in a 8.5 by 11. And like anything, there's a bunch of different ways that you can fail in this process. We're going to march through it step by step. And the first impression I'd love you to have is, oh, that's why it takes at least 6 months to get published. And then the other impression that I'd love for you to have is, oh, I can make this go easier by cooperating with the process, either by submitting things well, or by actually reviewing papers, right? All this, why can't they review my papers faster, right? We've all asked that question, and yet we have probably not been volunteering as reviewers at the same time, so we wind up with this, you have to contribute. So, call for manuscripts goes out. Some journals accept rolling submissions. You can submit online anytime you want, and they'll accept that as a submission. Others have specific submission time periods. If you're unsure about the time frame, you contact the editor-in-chief and you ask, what's the time frame? Remember the student who shows up with half the homework and the 80s and such, and then says, what do I need to do to get an A? We become a little bit like that student when we email a paper to the editor-in-chief and we say, here's my submission. You might look at it as the editor-in-chief and say it's appropriate within the scope, but it's usually not compliant with the guidelines for the journal. It usually has the author's name on it, which means it can't be blind reviewed. Right? So blind review, I'll come back to it. So You're asking questions of the editor-in-chief. I can't tell you how many times I've gotten very broken English and or text messaging syntax. The I's are lowercase, and U is a single letter somehow, and they want to submit a manuscript. And I'm saying, I don't want to read your email, Tom. I'm certainly not going to read a manuscript, right? So it's that first impression, and we've all sent things that didn't come out right when we typed them, and we've all reused documents that didn't have a spell checker. But this is email, right? If your email package doesn't have a spell checker, get a new one. Email questions as needed. Use some reasonable English grammar. So this manuscript, there's guidelines. Those guidelines, it's sort of like when we tell students there's a report standard. This is the way, walk ye in it. The report standard makes sure that they have all the right elements, and that the professor or the manager of the industrial report can actually find those elements and read them and find them. Well, those guidelines do the same thing. They put order and structure to it. You leave the names off and the affiliations off to allow for double-blind review. So this blind review, double-blind review becomes confusing sometimes. Blind review is the authors don't know who the reviewers are. Why would you do that? It's a small world, right? You could send them a box of chocolates to maybe help this process go along, or you could be reviewing an NSF grant that they are an applicant for, right? They tend to have overlapping domains. And so if people don't know who each other are, there can't be either the reality or the appearance of conflict of interest. And yet if it's a small enough field, there's a good chance you'll know who they are. We just got to trust professionals to be professional and do the right thing. So this double blind is the author and the reviewer, neither one knows who each other are. So the reviewer can't see who the author is, and the author can't see who the reviewer is, and so there's not a mechanism for favoritism. That's the idea of double-blind review. The references to the author's own work need to be obscured, redacted, so you either leave the name off the paper. Often in our work, we'll refer to our former publications, right? You have a research agenda that you're working on. In this paper I found X, and in this paper I found Y, and that motivated me to go look for Z, or whatever the next step is. You leave your name off your own references so that it doesn't disclose who the author is, or their affiliation, the university. So you can leave the reference in, just leave it blank, right? Or author's name removed, right? We all know what that means. It's clear. So this manuscript submittal, you have to submit it online in the system. When you do that, you agree to a couple of things. One, it's your work, right? You have the right to publish it. It is yours. And that it's not been published elsewhere. And so this question comes up a lot for people. You know, how high is the standard for not publishing elsewhere? And different people disagree on it. And my personal take on it is conferences are for exposure. In a conference, you get an idea out, and you get some feedback on it, and people say that wasn't clear, or that violates the second law of thermodynamics, or whatever. You get that feedback, and then the journal paper is where it goes from exposure to establishment. Right? I did this work and I found this. I would not publish the exact same thing at a conference in a journal, because you leave yourself open to criticism that's justly deserved. But you add some data to it, right? Well, how do I add data? Well, the easy way is you hold back data when you publish it in a conference, right? This is the technique. And so it is new information, and it is with the benefit of feedback. And now that you've got that feedback and the work's matured, you submit it to a journal. But you have to have some sense that that's okay with people in that journal to spin up a conference paper and add data to it. So you can have a frank conversation, and it doesn't start with, this paper was published at a conference and I want to submit it to your journal. This topic was discussed at a conference. I've since modified my thoughts on it and added some new data that I'd like to now publish. Oh, that's different, right? That sounds a lot different. So when you submit it, it gets a manuscript number. This whole paper is tracked in an online database by manuscript number. And unless it has a manuscript number, you can't have blind review, because the paper gets pushed out to all the reviewers based on the manuscript number, not based on the author's name. And so you can't be confidential unless it has a manuscript number. So emailing the editor-in-chief is kind of like when a student shows up with a report and the papers are all every which way, and there's no staple in it. What's the message there? You get those wads of paper? What's it say? Gustavo, guy hands you a mess. I know you're not busy. Put this in order and staple it for me, right? Do you feel that way? I just take 10 points. No problem. Here's a staple, ready, go. And I warn them ahead of time, right? So it's not a surprise. You don't hand people a mess and ask them to clean it up. So look at some of these manuscript submittals. Attempts, right? At least not the way it's supposed to be done. Look for the errors in this. So read this email. I have redacted it to protect the guilty. So JSET was applied technical research. Solve a problem. Try to highlight some of these. Manuscript contribution. This is not how you submit a manuscript. You do it in the online system. Right? You can make an inquiry this way, but you don't get the manuscript submitted unless you go to the website. We are willing to pay the cost of all related publications, right? This is the, right, because often there's a page charge. And the reason there's a page charge is because copy editing is not for the faint-hearted. And to take your well-written technical stuff and not fix it, but clean up the loose ends, right? Not rewrite sentences, but change the colons to the semicolons where they should be, and make sure the references are right. It takes a copy editor. And that work is on the order of $25 an hour, and a well-written paper probably takes a half an hour per page to fix up. And so when they start charging you 60, 70, 80, maybe $100 a page, you know, some of that's, I don't know where it goes, to tell you the truth, but those numbers are usual and customary. So they volunteers. First thing is 3 manuscripts. We're willing to pay all the costs. We tried to submit online but can't find the path for submission upload, right? Look at the titles. Manuscript's title. It's titles, okay? I know I'm being picky, but a theoretical study. This is an applied journal. As soon as I see the thing theoretical study in there, I'm saying if you would read the scope of the journal, you would know not to submit this manuscript here. It doesn't make sense. So look at this. Look at these titles. Watch this. These titles look kind of similar, don't they? Manuscript contribution to AGBAS. It's not JSET this time. It's some different thing. He's got the same titles. And he's referencing JSET. Still. Oh, you, my favorite. Right? My favorite. It's not that, so for context, I once sent an email to a guy named Dr. Ramadan. And the essence of this email was, Dear Dr. Ramadan, thank you for coming to campus today to look at my dissertation work. It was great to catch up with you after not seeing you for a couple of years. Have a great day. You ever have spell check change something for you and it doesn't come out the way you want? I get an email back from Dr. Ramadan. All it says is you butchered my name. I'm like, what? Dr. Ramadan turned into Dr. Deodorant. You can't make that up, right? So I've had those types of problems before, but I don't type the letter U. You know, I have problems despite trying, not because I don't try. Willing to pay the costs. It's a hanging sentence. He's got the same titles. AJBS, you begin to want to do a Google search. Australian Journal of Basic and Applied Sciences. You want to see the dates again? Is he submitting this to 2 places at the same time? It sure looks like it, right? And only he copied the wrong editor-in-chief. This is not, I don't get a warm fuzzy on this one, right? Example 3. Doctor writes lowercase, he's got some issues here. Doctor such and such, or the postdoc. The grammar just makes you go, oh, he wants to know about publishing his articles. They're not attached, and he never told me what the topics are. How do I help him? Right? So do you get this question too from students? They get an email that says, can I meet with you this week? Does anybody get that email? Can I meet with you this week?
Yeah.
And what do you say, Dr. Reynolds? Can you say it in public?
Yes.
Yes, yes, you can meet with me this week. Yes. And they say, well, when? Now we're starting to have a conversation, right? We're the third email in before any facts are being exchanged, right? If you would send it and say, can I meet with you this week? My times that I could possibly meet are this, this, this. You say, super, I'll fix you up on Tuesday. Look forward to seeing you. Right? So he's asking this vague question. Wants to know about fees. So here's the golden nugget. You're trying to grease the skids. Don't ruffle the feathers, right? There's no sense aggravating people at the first approach to talk with them by using text messaging syntax and submitting theoretical studies to an applied journal, right? Make sure, it should look like you've spent 30 minutes, or maybe 5 even, reading about what the focus of the journal is and putting some thought into spell checking. So this initial review, so let's assume they've submitted in the online system. The editor-in-chief looks at the paper and asks some questions to decide whether or not it fits within the scope. So the theoretical study in an applied journal is not within the scope. I've had papers submitted that were space exploration and such, which is maybe somewhat applied, but I didn't have the reviewers base to really give an informed opinion on those papers. And I rejected them because I couldn't give it a meaningful review, right? Nobody could comment on it. We just didn't have the depth in that area. We needed a more specialized field or journal. So is it within the scope? If yes, does it merit peer review? Is it written well enough that it's worth sending to busy people? If it's not good enough, I decline them subject to revisions. And I don't proofread it and do all that semicolon and colon stuff. I encourage them to go to their college writing center and get some help with it, right? Have another party review it and then resubmit when the grammar's clear. So you could, if it merits peer review, you could decline it or go to say, does it comply with the guidelines, right? Does it have some sort of flow to it? So how's the paper go? This is off the top of my head. Abstract, introduction, problem statement, data, experimental method, data, results, conclusion, suggestions for future work, right? You can leave a couple of them out of there, perhaps, and still have some flow to it. But there's a flow, right? Some of them have no flow. So if it complies with the guidelines, you select the reviewers and you assign the paper. So you get busy people somewhere to be willing to review this and get comments on it. And then as we go through this is really the essence of what I just described, but it's spelled out there so you can take it away with you on slide 16. Select reviewers based on matching the paper topic with the reviewer's expressed interest in the subject matter. So we often have reviewers who would, they have to register online as a reviewer, and they have to say what their interests are. And they say electrical engineering. Well, I don't know. I mean, that's broad, right? Do you want to do everything electrical engineering, or are there some key terms that you could give me? Or are you just, because then you reach out to an electrical paper, the electrical engineering guy, and he goes, oh, I don't do that. Well, then, in your profile, give me a few key terms so that I can send you things that are consistent with your interests. So how do you identify them? The reviewers have to have clearly articulated reviewing interests. So a list of terms, right? This is the brief overview. I could tell people that I do electronics manufacturing and manufacturing, or I could say mechanical engineering, or Dr. Reynolds' case, mechanical engineering, fluid flow, and I assume, I know you do deep fluids, maybe some heat transfer. Would excite, be curious to read it, right? So give some terms that are searchable so that the editor-in-chief can make it easier to match things up. So, goes out for peer review. Does it pass peer review? The answer is usually sort of, right? 2 reviewers liked it, 1 reviewer was hostile towards it. my approach was, unless someone had clearly violated the laws of physics in a way that was immediately obvious, I'd still publish it as long as it was well written. Because by the time you get through all the not well written stuff, if there's a little bit of a debate on whether or not the details are right, we might be on the verge of a breakthrough, right? So some of the great works, I know in materials engineering, some of the great works that today are foundational to our field are, they were a scandal when they were published, right? There's a big argument, right? The peer review was, they used to do peer review in writing. So you submit your paper, and then everybody writes a nastygram after your paper while using really nice words, kind of like the British Parliament, right? The esteemed senator from such and such is an idiot, right? You ever seen the British Parliament debates? They use really nice words and then they throw zingers in. Well, that's how these peer reviews went. So the question was, how often do they contradict? If they contradict, unless I can clearly see that one party has got a major concern that the work is erroneous, or it's been plagiarized or something like that, that's a deal breaker. But otherwise, I would publish it and let time sort it out, right? If it gets referred to a lot and built on, well, then it was right. If it falls away to the wayside, well, it was wrong. So then you have these reviews and you have these comments and you send them back to the author. So people would submit comments in a form and they would say, okay, sometimes it's for the editor only, sometimes it's for the author and the editor. I almost would rather have it for the author and the editor, because I've seen people say to the author and editor, they say, great work, very interesting, well articulated, whatever, and then for the editor only, the comment is, this work's a disaster, it should never be published. Well, how do I reconcile that, right? It's like having I don't have peer review, I can't give the person that feedback because there was nothing constructive and it was contradictory, right? They change their story depending on their audience. The editor-in-chief has 4 options, 3 of which are real. Accept as is, never, ever, ever, ever happens, right? It just doesn't happen. Accept pending revisions. So you would send them the comments, and the person would look at the comments and just decide whether or not to respond to them, right? They might decide that the reviewer's comment was erroneous. That's fine, right? I'm okay with the reviewer not being right about the paper that the person has spent a lot of time working on. But I would love for the author to give me a comment that says, I saw this, I reasoned it this way, I decided to proceed with it as it was because, right? It doesn't have to be real lengthy, but just says, I acknowledged it and we disagreed. Fine, I'm okay with that, good deal. We're about to ready to have a good conversation, right? Decline but encourage revisions. So it's decline, but go to the writing center, work through some of these things, resubmit after, and then there's decline outright, which is wrong scope. Really, the filter from the editor-in-chief has already happened with the grammar's just way too bad to bother looking at. We don't tell them it that way, but that's what it is. Feedback given to the author. So the reviews are forwarded. It'll say, our decision is to accept after adequate revisions. And then they have to upload a revised manuscript. So they had a manuscript, and it was prepared for blind peer review, so there were no names and affiliations on it. And these comments come back that say, this graph's not clear or whatever. When they submit the revised manuscript, they now include their name and affiliation, because we're past the blind review part. The only person that's going to see it now is the editor-in-chief. Part of it is you have to tell them what you expect, of course, right? They don't just know. And then you include a supporting file that says, these were the comments, this is the action I did or did not take. You get one of those back, and you're like, this guy, Nathan Hartman is his name. I can't even remember where he teaches. I used to love getting papers from this guy. They were clear, they were articulate, and when he followed up on stuff, it would be very clear what he had done. It was like, oh good, okay, well there's one in this issue that's gonna, just the process goes easy. And so we give them a time frame, and we give them a date, and it may be completely unrealistic based on their commitments, right? This one was August, guy or gal could have been on vacation for the next 3 weeks. So we say, let us know, right, if this is not reasonable. Reviewer forms. So you've got some reviewer forms in your file. I think it's the third packet in, and it talks about what are the questions that the reviewers look at. Is it within the scope of the journal? Does it comply with what we do and who we are? Is the work well grounded in the relevant literature? If it's not grounded in the literature, it's they call that fiction or something, right? It's a short story, right? Otherwise, it's just somebody's rambling on, right? I want to know that in light of so-and-so's work and so-and-so's work, this question arose, or I had this question, but then here's the background literature, and I built on that. They should have their paper well-based in the relevant literature. Then we ask, what additional literature review do you suggest? One of the reviewers might say, I think they're heading off in the wrong direction because they missed this paper. Then fine, we need to tell them that paper and give them a chance to do it. Is the work sufficiently original to warrant publication? It could be well written, it could be grounded in literature, but it's nothing that we don't all know, right? There's not something new there, and so we give a chance for that comment. Any known instances of prior publication? Fortunately, I've never had anyone answer yes to that. How likely is it to be cited by others? People could just say it's marginal. Fine. Let's put it out there and see if it grabs hold. Does the abstract adequately represent the content? There's some papers that I've read where there's an abstract, and there's bold statements, and there's conclusions, and then you go read the paper and you go, how'd they get that? Right? How'd you come up with that? It's kind of like the headline sometimes on the newspaper, and then you read the article and you're like, that article totally didn't support that headline. What happens there is the editor or the managing editor of the paper picks the title of the article based on a cursory read. That's part of what the confusion is there. Not with journals though. We don't do that. There's too much needs to stand as it was written. Is the conclusion well supported by the body of the work? Okay, length, American English. Why? Come on, it's kind of ethnocentric, isn't it? Well, if your English honor is H-O-N-O-U-R, color is spelled similarly, right? You talk about queuing up the samples. What do you mean queuing them up? What are you playing pool? Are you putting chalk on a? What are you talking about queuing, right? To us, those words mean something different, right? So American English. Tables, graphs, figures, readily understandable. How would you recommend improving them? And then it's just other stuff. There's no mechanism to lead those comments otherwise, and so put them in there and describe. Notice that the reviewer never went through the paper and fixed it all. They just highlight what the problems were. If you can't review a paper in an hour, it's probably because the paper is extremely poorly written and it should just be rejected. You don't have to prove, rederive all the equations. You just have to give it, because it passed the straight base test. Time will determine whether or not it was good stuff. Reviewer B comments, those are provided to you. These go back to the author. And so you're able to get feedback from third party. The author then makes those corrections, inserts names and affiliations based on the feedback. And they submit this document that explains the changes that they did or didn't make. It's fine not to make the changes that are recommended. It's just nice to know why they did it, but they made a decision. Copy editor. So copy editor is a grammarian, right? It's someone who really understands English grammar and formatting and such. They go through the paper with a fine-tooth comb and make sure that it's formatted right, which doesn't mean we accept that it's formatted poorly, but they check the fine details to make sure it's really right. The author incorporates those suggestions or explains their actions. Usually from copy editor to author, the author just says, sure, if you're going to publish it, fine. I don't care about semicolons and colons, just publish it. So really a writing expertise. Issue generation. So your article comes in and it's clear, and you participated in the reviewing process by reviewing other papers, either for that journal or another journal, right, to sort of contribute to the field, and you're good to go. Well, the problem is it's a little bit like lecture, right? You can't go at the pace of the fastest student, or you'll leave an awful lot of people behind. So there's other people who are having issues with their paper. And we've got to let them get sorted out before the manual. Everybody's got to be ready to go at once. This morning we took my mother-in-law to the airport in Shreveport, and my wife and I last night, I wanted to leave at 5. She wanted to leave at 5:30, and I said 5:15. So they knew we'd leave at 5:30. I can't roll that van until everybody gets all their stuff together and makes their last trip back in and whatever, right? You have to sort of realize the van can't leave until everybody's actually in it. Well, it's the same way with the issue generation. Process is gated by the slower reviewers and authors. Persevere, and people get published. That process is, I tell the students that, because our students get rather downhearted, and I tell them becoming an engineer is a little bit like making a sausage. It's kind of an ugly process to watch, but it's good when you get it done, right? And so it's a little bit like that with the journal stuff. The process is kind of messy and back and forth, and there's some pitfalls, but it works out well. Common mistakes. Article doesn't fit the journal scope. It's completely unsuited to the journal. The article's emailed to the editor-in-chief as a submission intent. They don't facilitate double-blind review. They have their names on it. They have their own references on it. They send inquiry emails in text messaging syntax and other poor grammar. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect, but it has to look like you tried. Summary. Disseminating scholarly results. It's fundamental to the academy. It's what we do. If we didn't publish, we'd be teachers. There's nothing wrong with that, but we shouldn't call ourselves professors if we don't generate and disseminate results. The question that you need to ask is, how do you cooperate with the process? It's not the student who shows up and says, half the homework, 79, 82, 83, what do I need for an A? You can't help him much. The guy who shows up in the beginning of the course and says, what do I do to maximize my chances of doing well in the class? You're going to tell him the obvious. Come to class, do the homework, focus on the things that I focus on, right? Get good rest, right? You're going to tell him very basic stuff that he ought to know, but at least you can tell him beforehand. There's not much you can do week 14 or 15, right? So how do you cooperate with this process? Timeliness, consistency with the journal scope, facilitate double blind. It's the same stuff again and again, and yet these are where people struggle. So you ask yourself, how do I make this easier to publish? It's not, what do I have to do to get this published? It's what do I do to make it easier to get it published? The editor-in-chief is looking for articles that are easy to publish. Make it easy to publish. And then you'll be the guy, I named an individual earlier. I've totally lost touch with him. I used to love to see his submissions. He's always organized. Call to action, publish, what we do. Volunteers a reviewer. Volunteers a reviewer. How come this process doesn't go faster? Because the reviewers don't do their assignments. Why don't you get more reviewers? Because they're volunteers. Why don't you push them harder? Because they're volunteers, right? We want to get things turned around. We have to volunteer to be able to contribute to it. So here's a question. You submit a paper, what's a reasonable number of papers for you to review? Well, if it takes roughly 3 people to review a paper, and you submit 1, you probably ought to review 3 somewhere else. And again, if you can't do it in an hour, it's not a good paper, right? There's a problem with the paper. What do you got for questions? So I went through a lot of stuff, and it's sort of my experience, but what's your experience? Where are the places that we're struggling or wondering publishing, move things forward?
What's the success rate? Acceptance rate?
Funny. So, I have a experience base of 1 journal, and we were extremely flexible on the nature of material that we would take. And if you include the people who blatantly do it wrong, theoretical study, emailed to the editor-in-chief, success rate might have been 20% or less, maybe. But we didn't have a super high standard. You just had to follow the process. And then there was a standard, but it was pretty easy to meet. So it's not that
So
it's
just
that hard.
following the
You just have to
instructions
do it,
gets
yeah,
you-
you have to follow the instructions. Yeah, so it's not that it's all that, and it's a process. It can't be done in a month, it can't be done in 2 months, it can't be done the month before tenure review. You gotta get stuff in the queue. It needs to mature. What else?
How do you select reviewers, just volunteers, and you don't screen them at all?
So the reviewers would fill out a form online. I would email engineering listserv and things of that nature. And anybody that was registered as a reader, because this journal was online. So it's an open access journal, which meant we publish it as PDF, and it was completely free, right, which isn't always the case. Open access means it's free eventually. This one was full open access, free from the get-go. So we'd email that base, and we'd get reviewers, and then they would fill out and say, my PhD or my master's degree or whatever is this, my reviewing interests are this, and I'd match them up. But after a while, you knew, I would always, so how do you grade a pile of papers? Maybe I'm the only one who does this. I grab a couple of students that are known to perform well, and I look at theirs first. Because I find some level of comfort when their answer matches mine, right? And then the writing starts flowing, right? Once I'm sure I've got it calibrated. Am I alone, or you just nod solid? The dean's facing this way. You won't know that you're not completely sure of the answer, except for the fact that he's human, and then he'll know. So what I would do is I would use one reviewer who I knew what kind of standard he held people to, whether it was high or low. I'd have one that was a known entity and a couple that might be new, and that way I had some sort of calibration. So if somebody was way off in left field, and the guy that was predictable was where I would expect them to be, we were okay. The reality is the editor-in-chief's a reviewer too, right? They're sort of the unwritten reviewer. Sometimes you'll sign up as a reviewer to give comments, because it's the mechanism where you can communicate very freely. But I rarely put papers up to the reviewers that I didn't think had a pretty good chance of being published. Does that help?
Yeah, and did you ever correct the reviewer in terms of comments the reviewer would give, and you as editor said, no, it's not valid?
I usually didn't. There was enough good to be gained, and it was easy enough to ignore the bad, that if they were providing timely reviews that were reasonable, if they were completely unreasonable, I just wouldn't assign papers to them again. If there was some sort of disagreement on a comment, I usually ignored it. But I might put a comment into the author when I submitted it that said, your two reviewers disagree. It's okay that you don't make them both happy. Pick one or some third option and explain why you did it. They're volunteers, they'll quit on you. What else? Yes?
Have you ever had papers come to you that were on the same subject and so similar that it's like you couldn't take them both? And what would you do in that case? I mean, because people
I didn't actually. I'm sure it happens, but I didn't have it happen. That's a good question. The concern I had that I didn't have much trouble with was this journal was run out of RIT, and I didn't want it to become a place where RIT professors came and put their arm around you, a bunch of coffee, and said, so my paper, right? I didn't want or to look like that. So they were always willing or always eligible to submit papers, but there was no preferential treatment whatsoever. And in fact, if I had more than one RIT submission per issue, I might hold it over to the next issue, because I didn't want it to look that way, right? I want it to be, it was published as an international journal, and what would happen, so that's the way it was communicated, and what would happen is that's part of why we get so many submissions that were in bad English, is because, it's international, you'll tolerate it. Well, I will, in fact, I'm very eager to have you, but you still need to fix your English.
And do you have someone that you would recommend, someone who isn't a Native American speaker, where you would say, here, you need to have this done, run it back through, and then resubmit?
Yeah, I wish our administration was here, so I could put in a sort of subtle plug. Most colleges have a writing center. We may have that, but it's not,
Official.
I'm not, it probably happens, but it's not, I've never been invited, let's put it that way.